Greetings. This is Griff Ruby with part 14 of my series, Sedevacantism, the Catholic Perspective. I want to pick up pretty much right where I left off. I was just beginning to show how the traditional bishops could, and in fact would have to be, the only possible legitimate recipients of the jurisdiction so blithely cast to the winds in Lumen Gentium. When Lumen Gentium allowed elements of sanctification and truth to exist outside its confines, de jure, not answerable to their leader, the only possible elements, gifts, clerics, who could be the recipients of this jurisdiction and authority to guide, rule, govern, and forgive sins in the name of the church, and do so with the indefectibility of the church, now could be the traditional clerics and principally the traditional bishops, because only they are valid. They are, by virtue of that, lawful, explicitly lawful, canonically lawful. They have not been, however, assigned specific territories, but that is not necessary. You got to remember, the church developed a diocesan structure over the course of the 3rd and 4th centuries. And, it wasn't so in the beginning. Nobody says, well, what was St. Paul's diocese? He didn't have one. St. Timothy didn't have one. You see, in those days, they didn't have that mechanism of subdividing things. Some particular, apostles and bishops settled in particular places. That is true, or stayed in some city, but nobody said, okay, everything from here to the river is mine, and beyond that river is yours. They weren't doing any of that. Like I said, that's kind of a 3rd, 4th, 5th era century development of the church. So what the church has created, the church can dismantle, and did dismantle with Lumen Gentium. So picture an ordinary bishop coming to the council. He was the bishop of some particular diocese. Lumen Gentium gets promulgated. Now he has a new office. The new office inherits the territoriality and all of the processes, the rotas, the physical plant, the secular aspect, if you will, that formerly belonged to the church, you see, is in the doppelganger. But in that doppelganger now, his new office is that he's a mere functionary of that particular territory. But as a real Catholic bishop, and at the beginning not incompatible, time would make it more and more incompatible until all the true bishops, just about would be forced to leave or what have you. But you see, there's enough overlap that, at the very, very outset, you really could have the two offices. And then over time, as they diverged, individual bishops would either devote their energies to the new doppelganger organization and thereby abandon their authority as a bishop, or they would devote their energies to the Catholic flocks, and not only in their territory, but anywhere and everywhere, which they now, like a religious order bishop, had the authority to do. So what this really means is this dissolves the diocesan boundaries. Now, I think there's 3 different ways we can illustrate that there's nothing really irregular. I already indicated before in the last installment the illustration where the vacated diocese gets filled in by bishops from other dioceses who basically put a bishop over a diocese to which they themselves had no apostolic assignment. Yet they could still provide that place with a bishop who would have an apostolic assignment. The next precedent would be, picture if in England, Bishop John Fisher had not been locked in a tower so promptly, and if B, it would have been that much harder to get clerics from, say, the seminary of Douai in France and other places into England, such that the bishop needs to make priests over the long term himself, and maybe even an episcopal successor in England. He would have had every right to function throughout England, as indeed the priests coming from the other place themselves functioned throughout England. Now, the third example comes actually in the text of the Lumen Gentium itself, because when you notice, their intent was to extend the mystical body of Christ to somehow encompassing all these Protestants and East Orthodox and other heretics and Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and Satanists and devil worshippers and anything and everything, you see, into the mystical body of Christ. Of course, that's not really possible, but they can choose to recognize any of those sorts as members of their organization. They can do what they like or not. But the thing was, in intending that sort of thing, there was never any attempt to apply to these different rival religious bodies to impose on them any of their own territorial and organizational structure. They wouldn't say to the Lutheran minister they want to now give jurisdiction to so they can say Mass with him and do everything and trade parishioners with him, and whatever else they want to do, and all nice, warm, fuzzy, ecumenical, whatever. They couldn't say, well, you Lutheran pastor belong to this, Catholic, really Novus Ordo diocese. That pastor can function wherever the Lutheran church sends him, you see. So in that same sense, though, since the real Catholic bishops are forced to function on this basis as bishops, now bereft of all this wonderful infrastructure the church had built up, but they are still bishops with visible canonical authority in the church over the priests, and the priests, over the laity, the religious, and so forth. So they still had that structure, that visible, lawful, canonical structure, you see, but now without the territoriality. That's why Lefebvre could work around the world. That's why Thuk could work around the world. Mendez, the Castro, they could have done whatever they wanted, any part of the world, like a religious order bishop. See, that's no less legitimate. And the same goes for their successors. Now, I know there are those who say that, well, the traditional bishops today have no real jurisdiction. They have no nothing. They have no faculties. They can't do anything. And that is a lie from the pit of hell. Because if our traditional bishops don't have that kind of authority, then it doesn't exist. It's gone. And that is to say that the church no longer exists as a hierarchical organization, and that would be such a fundamental change to the whole nature of the church as to basically turn it into something else. It would be the end of Christianity, period. It would be the ultimate falsification if that could ever really happen. So the traditional bishops, as the only ones who we know are validly ordained and consecrated, and the only ones we know who are truly orthodox and in line with nearly 2,000 years of Christian tradition, you see, they are the only possible holders of Roman Catholic hierarchical authority. So, that being the case, what exactly are they canonically? I'll get to that in the next installment.